All right, well, welcome everybody. We're really pleased to have you. I'm Rob Bennett. I'm the founder and executive director of Eco Districts, and pleased to be joined today on our October webinar Wednesday series with Tamika Butler, founder and principal of Tamika L. Butler Consulting. Tamika is as we're going to find out, is sort of the perfect person, I think, for our times as we're grappling with an unprecedented series of tragedies and pandemics that are facing the country, and particularly facing people of color. And in our work at Eco Districts, where we're really working to be at the intersection of equity, resilience, and climate action in community and urban development, Tamika is kind of the perfect person to talk about these issues, given her wide range of experience. Wanted to thank our sponsors for this event, and they include the JPB Foundation and the Kresge Foundation for making this work in this webinar series possible. And as many of you know, and hopefully many of you have been on our webinar, and many of you are part of our community, and for those who are new, our work at Eco Districts is quite simple in the vision of creating just, resilient, and sustainable cities, working from the neighborhood up. But of course, the work is extremely complicated and nuanced because it's ultimately about the people who live in our communities and the people who grapple with the issues of urban planning and design and how we live in cities. Many of you know that our work is framed around a set of intersectional issues that we call out in our Eco Districts protocol and certification program. And I think Tamika is going to touch on many of these issues today in her webinar talk. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Tamika. She has a tremendously diverse background, a practicing attorney, a community organizer, an advocate, and a practicing planner and professional. She is, as I mentioned, the principal of her own firm, Tamika Butler Consulting, but most recently she was the director of planning for California and the director of equity and inclusion for Tool Design, formerly also the executive director of the LA Neighborhood Land Trust and the executive director of the LA County Bicycle Coalition from 2014. So she has this tremendous background in transportation issues and transportation equity and land use and advocacy. So we're really pleased. Thank you, Tamika. I know you're extremely busy, but we're really pleased to have you in our webinar series and to introduce you to the Eco Districts community. So take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Got that last sniffle out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully there will be plenty of time to answer a couple of questions at the end, but I will dive right in. Actually, let me do it this way. Here we go. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about climate, place, and equity. I'm a person that likes to set clear expectations. I tell you what I'm talking about, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and where I work. I want to talk specifically about the LA County Sustainability Plan, which I was honored to be a consultant on, and then transition into why some of the things we did with the LA County Sustainability Plan are important and why they matter. And then end with thinking about how folks can make this equity stuff actionable for themselves. So first, who am I? I think, I'm someone who likes to bike. I'd like to say that I come to this transportation work and sustainability work as someone who just loves to bike. Now, the fact that I love to bike doesn't mean that one of my main identities as a cyclist. I really identify as a queer, genderqueer woman of color, particularly a Black woman. I think being a Black woman really shapes who I am. I'd say the other identity that's right up there for me is being a Midwesterner. I'm very proudly a Midwesterner, and I think that's a big part of who I am. Now, most recently, I was working at Tool Design, um, where I learned a lot, absolutely appreciate and enjoyed my time there. Um, but as everything happened these last few months, things that used to be a side hustle started taking up more time. And in July, I decided to start my own consulting practice, Tamika L. Butler Consulting. And I've really been lucky enough to be very busy and to be doing work at the intersections of built environment, transportation, and justice and equity. Um, and that is work I was doing even when I was at Tool Design, and frankly, even before I got there. And so before I started at Tool Design, again, always had this little side hustle as being a consultant. One of the clients that I started working with was the LA County Sustainability Office. It's a great team of folks who are really thinking about who does LA County belong to and what is the work they should be doing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan because sometimes I do this talk and I don't go into as much detail in the plan, and folks really have a lot of questions. So just to give you a primer of kind of, this group of people that I spend a lot of time with, that I spend time with on a weekly basis, and talking through what sustainability means in LA County. I really admire how we put the plan together and how we looked at this work. And so the LA County Sustainability Plan is called the Our County Plan. That it's really about all of LA County. And for folks who don't know LA County well, first, I think it's important for all of us to always acknowledge that we are on stolen land. And so LA County, even before there were lines on a map, was a place that was inhabited by Indigenous people. Beyond that, LA County is just huge. 1 out of 4 Californians live in LA County, and 1 out of 33 Americans. Just let that sink in for a while. It is a place with multiple different climates. We have coastland, we have inland, and that it's, it has a huge economy. And so figuring out sustainability in LA County and working towards it is huge. The team that was put together was led by a bunch of consultants. Bureau Happel was really the lead. And then Liberty Hill. Liberty Hill is a foundation. It's a foundation I actually used to work at. And it's a foundation that focuses on funding groups on the front lines of racial justice movements. And it's really about community organizing. And that's why, usually when you look at these kind of charts, you kind of see the lead consultants, and then you see kind of the sub-consultants, and then there might be some mention of working with community. But in this plan, the community were the core of what we were doing. And all of these groups are groups that worry about sustainability, environmental racism, all of these things every day. And so when we were trying to figure out what to put in the plan, we understood that it had to be a plan that was about how community members viewed their county and what their voices wanted to add to the plan. And so we did these community workshops all over the county. Every workshop looked different. But if you look at the picture in the bottom left, what you'll see is we had actual community members leading the community engagement. Every LA County is divided into, despite its size, is divided into 5 supervisor districts, only 5, which is why we had 5 nonprofits, and every event was different. One was at a community college, and it was in a gym, and there were crafts and arts and all sorts of things happening. And then some were, the one in South LA where I live was at the African American History Museum, where we encourage folks to look at the museum, to bring people into an art space that often community members don't think is for them, and then to also participate. And it was really, really exciting to see community members talk about, though they might use different words, talk about things like transportation or biodiversity, and talk about it in detail. Again, even if they weren't using the terminology that some of the experts use, it was really respecting their voice as community members and not going into a plan and saying, this is what the plan has to say, but instead going in and saying, we know we want to do a plan. What does the community think it has to say? And as we came out, we organized the plan to have goals, strategies, actions, and then targets and indicators of what we were going to do. The goals were across the board, anything from transportation to a sustainable food system, to equitable land use, to access to parks, buildings and infrastructure, that supported resilience, right? And so this was a plan that covered a lot of different areas. And then each goal had different strategies. And then each strategy had different targets based on what year we're coming up. And then how long-term or short-term was the goal, and who was the lead department, understanding that this was going to take more than just a 4-person sustainability office to get done. And so again, we covered a wide gamut of topics, and we aligned it with the LA City sustainability plan. But at the core, and why I like to talk about this plan, as it will tie to everything else I'm talking about with equity, at the core of this plan was that we knew we had to define equity, and we had to define equity on multiple levels. We had to understand that there's a difference between procedural equity and the process. It's not just about outcomes, it's about process. It's about how we distribute benefits and burdens, right? So if there are going to be people impacted by the goals and decisions we're making, one, are they part of the decision-making process? And two, how do we distribute those benefits and burdens? How do we recognize structural equity and the things that are just built into the place to advantage or disadvantage certain groups, and that it's happened over time? And then I think the other piece that is so important when you're talking about climate and place is transgenerational equity, and realizing that things we do today are going to have impacts, just like things that happened generations ago continue to have impacts. And I think as we think about our national election, that seems more important than ever. What are the transgenerational equity impacts? And so too often folks try to simplify equity, but what I really appreciate is we do this work, we have to think about equity on every structure, and then we also have to be willing to think about intersectionality. And so even though part of the plan was about living streets, we understood that living streets is about transportation, but it's also about public health. It's also about stormwater management. It's also about urban forestry, right? So how do you think about climate and always think about place? Always think about equity built into what you're talking about. And intersectionality is a big part of that. Again, addressing oil and gas is about redressing the siting of polluting facilities and environmental justice communities, but it's also about worker safety. It's also about GHG emissions. It's about improving air, water, and soil quality. So how do you put all of those things together, right? And again, I said I wanted to give a little bit, just a snippet about the LA County Sustainability Plan. And so that's the snippet. For folks who want to learn more, here's the website. It's an awesome plan. I was very proud to be a part of it. But again, why does this matter, right? So some folks might be saying, wait a minute, I didn't think I was coming to learn about one specific thing. I thought I was coming to think about how I think about equity and all of these things. And particularly, are we just talking about climate, or are we also talking about place? And we're also talking about place, right? And place is something that for whatever reason, we like to pretend that place is just somehow there, right? You are where you are, and then there is place. But the reality is our country and the place that we are in is built on a history of white supremacy, right? So ever since folks showed up and discovered something in the same week that we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, we have to realize that place has always been about stealing land, taking things, renaming it, redesigning it, and trying to attribute it to certain groups and tell other groups that they don't belong there, right? That is so much a part of place. And so when you think about place, you have to think about equity, because place has always been about who's on the other side of the tracks, who doesn't get to be here. And when we think of things that are theoretically public places like swimming pools, what is their history? Like parks, right? There are so many. My mother grew up in segregated South Carolina. She tells me all the time about the beautiful beaches in South Carolina, but the beaches she was allowed to go to versus the white kids, right? So we know that there are so many times when folks who look like me are on the outside looking in, and that shouldn't surprise us. This is a book written by someone that folks call one of the forefathers of our national park system. This is also a book that Hitler says is his Bible, right? Was his Bible. That this was one of the books he looked to because the author talked about how people of color dilute the human race. And so it's not surprising that if this person wrote this book, if this person was admired by Hitler, and if this person also helped start the park system, that we have to acknowledge that it was a system built upon, again, taking land from some, putting up signs, keeping them out, and telling them that they were too savage to go there. And how does that legacy continue? Well, you look at data about who uses public space and national parks, and you still see that people of color go in fewer numbers, right? And it's not by accident. Redlining. There was always a system of saying, where is it okay to be? Where is it the hood? Where should we invest money? What should we not invest? And where should we push people out? When you think about land use, when you think about zoning, where is it okay to oil drill, right? Where is it okay to have toxic sites? Where is it okay to build highways and divide communities? Where are there off ramps on that highway system? Where are there places that are inviting you to explore? And where are there places that don't have off ramps and that you just drive right through? And when we think about a place, again, I'm in LA, like South LA, that is predominantly Black and brown, or a place like West LA that is predominantly white, you see the impacts of place. You see the impacts of these policies and how they drastically change what people have access to and whether or not people can live active, productive lives. And look, I'm a transportation planner. Sometimes when I talk to other transportation planners, they're like, yeah, that's, yeah, I hear you about oil drilling. I hear you about the highway system, but like, I'm a transportation planner. What am I supposed to do about those other issues? That's why I started with the LA County Sustainability Plan, because we approach it from a perspective that all of these issues are intertwined. And even as the official who shows up to help, if we think that these issues are different and that they're in their own silos, that is not how the people who we theoretically are there to help feel, right? They know that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because they don't leave single issue lives. They know that their neighborhoods are killing them. And for many people, that is heavy, that's hard, and they don't want to think about that legacy or that past of how all of these things operated to not just, push people of color and low-income people out of space, but really prevent them from staying in space. Sometimes when we think about mobility, and when we think about place, we think about wanting people to be able to move freely, and that's important, but people should also be able to stay in place without their neighborhoods killing them. And again, I know for a lot of people that's like, what? Why are we why are we talking about all of these things? Why can't we just stay focused? And I would argue because it's more important now than ever, right? COVID-19 has laid bare some of the issues and the ways that climate and that racism overlap with place. And we know that as climate change has ravaged the West Coast, up and down as we've seen fires, farm workers don't get to just zoom in at their meeting, close their windows, and pretend like it's not happening. That's who we're still depending on to put themselves at risk to serve the rest of us. We know it's true for the people delivering our mail and our packages. We know it's true for the people checking us out at the grocery store. Low-income people and folks of color are putting themselves at risk every day in places so that the rest of us can just carry on. And it's more important now than ever because we are facing two pandemics in our country. We are facing racism and we are facing COVID-19. They are ravaging communities like mine. We are literally living in two different countries where some people are more worried about their boozy brunch and others, we are trying to create space literally in the streets to say that our lives are worth it and valid. And people want to criticize us and say, well, I would support that if you weren't burning things down or if you weren't doing this. But the reality is that for many of us, I've already talked about some of the past, but this has been going on before COVID, right? We have seen story after story about how policing has been used to hunt Black and brown people. We have people who say, when you talk about transportation, why do you talk about race? Well, because transportation was always based in the civil rights movement. And it's not just transportation. If you are doing work where you care about place and place making and place keeping, you have to be thinking about race, whether or not you're talking about the criminal justice system, whether or not you're talking about environmental racism, and again, the toxicity in our low-income communities and communities of color. If you're talking about our segregated education system, right? Right now, we have a census that has been cut short that is going to determine years of funding, no matter what happens in the election. And so there is intentional planning to keep some of us oppressed and cut off from resources. And it's just the continuation of what was always there. And I already talked about redlining, right? And this is a great book. Folks should read this book. Many folks have. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. And what I always like to point out about this book is while it is great, its subtitle is also A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And I would say a forgotten history for whom, right? This is still such a white-centered frame. Because for many of us who continue to be impacted by the legacy of white supremacy, institutionalized racism, and frankly, anti-Blackness, we haven't forgotten anything. We haven't been able to build wealth, let alone transportation mobility or economic mobility. And so we know these things to be absolutely true. And we know it was true then, and we know it's true now. You would be hard pressed to find Black, brown, indigenous folks who haven't been deeply impacted by COVID-19, who don't know someone they've lost, like my friend from college, who don't know essential workers, who never stopped working, who never stopped putting themselves at risk. My mom, my sister. And so when we talk about placemaking, it's curious that only now are people opening their eyes to talking about the intersections between things like public health and planning and race. Because the reality is, even though I've never watched this George Floyd video, I've seen this shot and I've seen that green bike lane in the back. I've seen that there was some investment in creating place. I've seen that there was some investment in the environment and, more sustainable modes of transportation and mode shift. But those things don't save Black lives if they are planned in the absence of being willing to address anti-Blackness and white supremacy and racism. We can't simply say, we're going to create place and we're going to help people have access to open space and help with the environment by slowing down streets or creating open streets. And it's going to be safe. Because if you can't walk or run in your own neighborhood without fearing your death, then it's not safe. If you can't ride your bike without being stopped by the police officers and ultimately losing your life, then it's not safe. And again, this pandemic is hard, right? We're on Zoom after Zoom in our living rooms, sometimes in our cars. We have kids coming in and out, asking us for help, asking us for food. Kids are always hungry, asking for help on their homework. There is a lot on our shoulders. But I would submit that when we're talking about creating spaces and places, as we're talking about the future of our countries, we're talking about the future of climate sustainability, you have to wonder that for your colleagues who are members of oppressed groups, whether or not they have disabilities, whether or not they're queer, whether or not they're immigrants, and especially if they are Black, there is so much on our mind where it is sometimes hard to just show up and just be like, oh, great, we're not going to talk about Breonna Taylor. We're in a planning space and we're not going to talk about the policy that made that no-knock warrant valid and how it's a planning tool. We're not going to talk about these things. But you just want me to show up. You want me to be on time. You want me to submit my assignment. You want me to do this thing. We're not going to honestly talk about the fact that some of us can't separate personal from private. Because every day when we show up, I'm still Black. I'm still queer. And I wish I had the privilege to only focus on work. But instead, what I'm thinking about whether or not my work is going to be valued and I will be valued for what I contribute in my work. Or if the only time people will know who I am and what I've contributed is if I become another name on a list, if I become a hashtag. And so when we think about why the way we do this work should forever change, think about your colleagues of color. Think about your Black colleagues and what you will realize. And I give a little bit of a seizure warning on this next slide because that's how it feels to be Black right now. We're not okay, but people don't seem to care. They just want to move on. And particularly in planning spaces and environmental justice spaces, environmental spaces, right? Folks in power are still typically white and white men. And often what they want to say is like, this is just too much. I just want to sit at my computer in peace. This makes me want to pull my hair out. And more than anything, why are you telling me about this? I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not a racist. Why can't you just make this stop? Because it's a lot. And I would submit, if you are doing this work and you are looking towards the future and you are wondering how you can push this work forward and how you can do it in an equitable way, I would ask, why aren't you thinking about this stuff all the time? It is a lot. But too often, if something is not a problem to you personally, and therefore you don't think about it, then you have to ask yourself why. And you have to really challenge your privilege, right? Because again, those folks we depend on, picking our food in the field, checking us out at the grocery store, being our nurses and our doctors, those folks of color, this is a problem to them. So even if you think it doesn't impact you personally, the people for whom you depend on, it impacts them. And so while you might want to stop thinking about this, we want people to stop killing us. And if you're wondering, well, how can I do that as someone who cares about the environment and land use? Well, you have to ask yourself, what can you do? How can you be part of the institutional change that we want to see, right? Like, first, you have to think about power. You have to understand what power is, and you have to understand there's a difference between power over people and power with people. We like to talk about empowering people, but empowering people is such a colonial term because it's still predicated on the idea that somehow some of us are worthy enough to have power, and only when we bestow it upon others will they be able to do anything. When in reality, so many folks have power, communities have power, so we should be co-powering with them. When you think about it in another way, and we think about equity, right? Because you can't achieve equity if you're not thinking about power and privilege. And so a lot of us have seen this picture, right? And I hate this picture, and I think people should stop using it. I hate the picture because it doesn't actually show the reality of where some people are starting. And beyond that, it doesn't actually show the goal that we should be trying to get to. And it doesn't show that we should be really working towards liberation, towards freedom, right? Again, I'm a transportation person. So whether or not I'm thinking about climate or whether or not I'm thinking about housing, I'm thinking about how do people get to the places they want to get freely with dignity, right? That's what we should be aiming for. And beyond that, again, I said you have to understand power. Power is the hidden fence in this picture because someone has still determined that what these three folks want is to watch a baseball game. But what if you hate baseball? What if you want to play? What if you want to be the umpire? What if you want to coach? What if you want to own the team? What if you're like, you know, a super savvy business person and you want to have the exclusive deal with the ballpark to provide all of their food? Liberation can't truly come unless folks have some ability to self-determine who they are, what they want, and where they want to be. And that's hard because that means, again, relinquishing some power. That means pushing towards that institutional change, going back to that, by letting go of power. And in order to do that, you have to create brave spaces. And I say brave spaces intentionally, not safe spaces, because there are some people who never feel safe. As a genderqueer Black person in this country, I'm keenly aware that every time I leave the house, it could be my last. I'm keenly aware that many people, especially when I'm wearing a suit and tie, see me as a young Black man, and I know how dangerous that is in this country. The color of my skin is always, always a weapon. And even if I'm in a professional setting, I can't stop being Black. And so it's not uncommon for people to say I'm angry or too emotional, right? If I speak up. And so I know every day to be my full authentic self, I have to be brave. If you're a person who has the privilege to think I want to be comfortable or I want to be safe, and there are some places where I feel comfortable and safe, then realize that privilege and focus yourself on getting out of it. Being in a brave space and creating a brave space, first and foremost, takes vulnerability. You have to be vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, you're open to the fact that you may make mistakes. And that when you make mistakes, you're going to acknowledge it and you're going to keep going and you're going to keep trying. Too often, folks get into these conversations and they do one of two things. They're afraid to acknowledge that they don't have expertise. And the reality is, we all have limits on our expertise. Or they're not afraid to acknowledge it because they don't, and they are not self aware of the limit on their expertise. And so when they make a mistake, they can't own that, can't be accountable. They can't just say, oh man, I got this wrong. And instead, the fear of saying something or doing something wrong, of being called a racist or doing something racist, makes folks shut down and not even engage. That's not brave. And again, some of your colleagues don't have that privilege. And so if you want to create a brave space, you have to be willing to listen deeply. That doesn't mean listen to respond, which is what most of us do, especially with our partners. Listening deeply and speaking your truth is important. And it's also important to just acknowledge that when you're having conversations about equity and racism, that there's past harm and past trauma, and you just have to hold space for that. And once you do that, you can start to understand the role that power plays. You can start to think about that invisible fence I was talking about. And when you're thinking about power, there's a lot of things you can ask yourself, but most important is, who has the power to make decisions, right? Because sometimes we think if we just get a more diverse group of people, we're fine. But diversity for diversity's sake isn't actually inclusion. Inclusion is when those diverse people have some power, when they can make decisions, when they can set culture. And so you have to ask yourself, the things we're trying to do, the positive environmental like policies we're trying to pass, the place we're trying to create, who has the power to make decisions? And you have to pair that question with the question of, who will be most impacted by the decisions? And are those people in decision making positions? Are they the ones with power? So you first have to own who has the power, and are those the same people who are most impacted? And if they're not, why? Maybe because you looked at some data. Well, what data do we value? Who do we listen to? Who do we take seriously? Who do we see as an expert, right? And you have to challenge that privilege. Is someone an expert because they have a fancy degree or a fancy certification? What about the person who's in the community every single day? Don't they actually know more? Don't they actually have some power? And what privilege did I have to get here? These are the questions, and these are the things we have to do. And I think, I'll end by saying that when we know that COVID-19 is ravaging the country, there are a lot of people who have said, well, this is a really good opportunity. Insert policy here, insert idea here. And one of my friends and colleagues, Naomi Dorner, she tweeted, in April when this was all starting, if one more white person in my planning profession say that the COVID-19 pandemic presents an opportunity too, I'm going to unmute myself when I scream so that they can get a taste of the trauma I feel. For so long, communities of color and low-income communities, and again, particularly Black communities, beyond that, queer folks, folks with disability, Indigenous folks, we have been planned against. It hasn't been on accident. It's been on purpose. And so this idea that there's this opportunistic moment where we can try to do new things, it's hurtful and it's dismissive to the real trauma that has been deployed in the name of environmentalism, in the name of transportation, right? And for some of us, this was in April. Imagine how we feel now. Imagine that trauma now. And I know as this has gone on and gone on, there's been a lot of talk of like, yeah, but at some point we'll get back to normal. And the real question is normal good enough? Something I said when this first started is, I don't want to get back to normal. Being better than now shouldn't be good enough. Because as a Black person, I've always known that the old normal meant my life was expendable. And I know now in this new normal that we're in, my life is also expendable. And so if we want to create places, if we want to place make, if we want to place keep, if we want to do cutting edge environmental work, cutting edge transportation work, at some point we have to realize that some of the systems and inequities that have been in place have been intentional, have been very thoughtful, have been very strategic. It's not a forgotten history. It's something that's been happening for decades. It's something that is going to take time to undo, but we are in a place of urgency. We don't have a lot of time left, and we can't only rely on our colleagues and our peers who are part of oppressed groups to fix it. They aren't the ones who created many of these problems. And so everyone has to look within. Everyone has to realize that you have a personal stake in this. You have to realize the urgency. And in addition to doing all the things like going out and voting, you have to look up every single day and say, what am I going to do? What is my role? And how can I take responsibility and hold myself accountable? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamika. Very powerful and forthright. And I think as you talked about your own experiences and the sort of white-centric nature of the work that many of us have been involved in urban planning, urban design, I think we just really want to honor you taking the time here to share your story and to challenge, you know, the industry that you're very much a leader in. So thank you for that. We have 20 minutes for questions, and I forgot at the top of the hour to mention, please put questions into the chat function. I put that I put that in the chat while Tamika was talking, but I imagine many of you have questions. Questions are starting to come. And I wanted to start with the frame that you are talking about, in that sort of both needing to understand the very sort of inherent issues and sort of not addressing, but uncovering, making clear the power dynamics in certain place, recognizing not only the power dynamics inside community, but also those who are making decisions on behalf of community, in quotes, transportation officials, urban planning officials, the developers. Can you talk about your experience in, you know, applying what you're talking about in some of the key observations or key you know, lessons from some of this work where you've seen equity be explicitly addressed thoughtfully, and what were some of the outcomes from that, or some of the lessons learned that you could share?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me, Rob. This has been great. I love the work you all do. And I think, you know, the first example I would say is definitely the LA County Sustainability Plan. It was really refreshing to be working with a government entity that said, hey, you know what? There are some clear environmental challenges in LA County, and there are some clear things we would put into this plan. But we got to go talk to people. And there was just this openness that what the final plan might entail might not be exactly what they had conceptualized as the experts, right? As the paid professionals. And so I think anytime you have systems set up where you are allowing yourself and you are giving space for the fact that what you think might be coming might be different in the end, I think that's one of the real ingredients to doing equity work. And I always talk about it as the difference between engagement and outreach. Outreach is just going out and saying, here's what we're going to do. Actual engagement is saying, here's what we plan to do, but what do you think? And being open, again, to the fact that that might not work out. I think another example is Oakland Department of Transportation, right? There are many mixed views about Oakland Department of Transportation, but many also hold them up as a good example of equity. I think in large part because of the folks of color who have worked there. I know Brittany Brown used to work at the Oakland Department of Transportation, and she led this project in East Oakland that was about, you know, creating bike lanes, a bike project. But they really listened to the community, and now the bike lane is down the middle of the street because culturally, the folks in that community with their flashy, nice like bikes were like, but this is how we ride. And it's not green, right? It's like colors that the community and symbolism that the community, it's art. The bike lane is art. I think, you know, Ryan Russo, the head of the Department of Transportation, talks about their paving program and how they centered equity in their paving program and what it was like to go to community meetings and have folks who weren't from East Oakland say, but why are you going there first? We need potholes filled in our hills too. And then the last example from Oakland is their Slow Streets project during the pandemic. They put it out, it got wide acclaim, New York Times, everything. Transportation and bike people were like, this is amazing, right? But certain community members are like, this ain't it. Like, how is this helpful? This is not what I need the most. And so they very quickly took that feedback and then they launched Slow Streets, Essential Places, right? And then they started focusing on infrastructure that would help people get to the corner store or whatever it would be. So I think this idea of listening and then being open to what you think is right might not be right. And even if you go forward with the thing that might not be right, are you flexible and are you humble enough to say we got this wrong and to change course?
Yeah, you mentioned those issues of sort of engagement and moving sort of beyond that. And we agree, you know, one of the key underpinnings of the ecodistrict approach is that idea of local leadership and governance, you know, governance systems that ultimately can help steward projects, shape projects, potentially invest in projects locally. Do you see, you know, I mean, beyond building much, you know, a much more understanding and much more nuanced sort of profession that centers around equity and the experiences of Black folks and communities of color, do you see new models of sort of power sharing around sort of economic decisions in communities? And have you experienced some of that participatory budgeting or real decision making where communities have a much greater say in the kind of investments? As you talked about this, the streets program in Oakland, you know, it's not so much the tactic, it's sort of the way we get to that decision. And have you experienced any of in that realm?
Yeah, absolutely. The panel I was on before this was with MIT, and there's a woman there, Dana Cunningham, who's the executive director of the MIT CoLab. And the whole purpose of the CoLab is to do work with community, right? So they approach their work by saying, how can we capture value in the built environment? And how can we go to the community and partner with them, value them as experts? And so I think there are more and more people starting to think about this and do this. Now, something we both laughed about on the panel we were just on is she's not trained as a planner either. Or she said she's also a recovering lawyer, right? And so again, it's folks outside of this planning profession who are being like, whoa, planners, why are you doing it this way? Let's think about it in this other way. And so I do think there are people who are setting up systems for participatory fundraising, participatory budgeting. Here in LA, just like in many cities, we have an advocacy group called who are pushing the people's budget, right? We saw that in Minneapolis after the killing of George Floyd. And so I think the problem isn't that there aren't community members or advocates trying to do this work. I think there have always been community organizers at the grassroots trying to do participatory planning. I think they haven't been viewed as valid and they haven't been appreciated by the people in power structures. And so I think when you have government entities who are, again, willing to relinquish some of that power and listen, I think that's when you have some of the really beautiful work happen.
Great, thank you. There's a series of questions. They're coming fast and furious, so I apologize to anyone who we don't get to. But a series of questions about kind of the institutional work. I know at Tool you led a lot of the institutional work. We know that the design industry is extremely, white dominant, built on white supremacy. We know that to be true in public agencies as well. Can you talk about your experience? And there's some questions here from people of color, professionals of color who are wanting advice on how to build more traction inside their organizations, and also white practitioners on this webinar who are looking for ways that they can be more influential and effective in advocating for the kind of change that we need in our profession.
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of comments that are like, if I'm junior in the organization, how do I do this? And I think, my answer is twofold. For folks of color, the quote I always share, always, 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 and if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me say it, is you don't have to light yourself on fire to keep other people warm. I don't think non-folks of color, or again, non-folks who are in any oppressed group, understand the true psychological, mental, physical stress that it takes to do this work if you are a person of color, and in particular a woman of color, in particular a Black woman, right? And then anybody at multiple intersections of those identities. Something I always share, because I do think that sometimes white folks are like, yeah, well, in my personal life, like I went out and marched, I made this donation, I'm politically aligned in this way, but in my professional work, I am doing what the client wants or what my boss wants. Like, this is the professional setting. And I always say that ability to separate professional and private is really a white people thing, like, because the rest of us can't separate that. And so often we do this thing where we allow ourselves to be tokenized because we look around and we're like, well, if I don't speak up, who's going to speak up? And so the first thing I say is, like, it is revolutionary to take care of yourself. It is a good follow on social media is the NAP Ministry. It's a Black woman who started social media accounts. And it's just about, like, it's okay to rest. We don't have to completely burn ourselves out to keep other people going. I think in addition to that, for the non-folks of color, what we're really looking for are accomplices, right? I think a lot of people talk about allies, and I think we're finally to a place where people realize that ally is not just a noun, it's an action. It's like, what are you doing? But the difference I always give between ally and accomplice is when you're a woman in a meeting and you say something and no one pays attention, and then Rob says something and everyone's like, Rob, good point. And you're like, oh, I already said that. An ally pulls you aside after, takes you to lunch, sends you an email, and it's like, I just want you to know, Tamika, I know you said it first. Like, I don't know why no one heard you and they only listened to Rob. An accomplice speaks up in the meeting in front of everybody, right? Because the reality is that when you are constantly the person who speaks up, and particularly women of color, we are risking something every single day. We're risking our jobs, we're risking career advancement. Like, if you don't know what it's like to head home from work and wonder if you're going to be able to provide for your family just because you spoke up, then you don't really get the struggle, right? And the reality is that an accomplice is willing to risk those same things. But the reason people don't do it, the reason people are only allies, is because they know, they're like, oh, here comes Tamika again, always speaking about this. Here comes the disability person again. And they don't want to speak up in front of other people because they don't want to be placed in that group. They don't want to lose anything. They don't want to risk anything. And so we need accomplices. And then the last thing I'll say on this is that true change, I heard another speaker say this the other day, you can hire a chief equity officer, you can put together a task force, you can allocate some budget money. But if we really want to make change on these issues, it's going to come down to will and leadership. And it's not enough to hire a chief equity officer or create a task force if they don't have access to decision makers, and if decision makers don't trust them or take them seriously, only fill them in as an afterthought. And so we really need leadership to step up.
Thank you. Last week we did a workshop in Tacoma with a former colleague, Maka Agbo, who also is in Oakland and formerly of Ella Baker Center, and a restorative economics professional. And she talks a lot about the need for, ultimately for power to translate into ownership in community. And there's some questions here to that point. The question sort of about the handover of power, the sort of the real sort of moving from engagement again to governance. Can you, do you have any tools or experience in where, you ran the LA Land Trust, and that's about building power and building wealth in community. Can you talk a little bit about either your observations, your experience, reflections on that question as the real mechanism for change,
Yeah. Yeah, and even tying it to some of those questions about like, well, what do you do if you're just a consultant and your client doesn't want to do this work, right? And I think I was talking to my wife right before this call, and we were talking about a friend who's having, some disagreements with their higher ups about a stance the company is taking on something. And she was like, capitalism, man. It's like, it's hard to make enough money to live and thrive in cities like LA, San Francisco, New York, Portland, Seattle, right? Like, it's hard to make enough and not sometimes be in these compromising positions. And so I think sometimes you have to understand that, like, you push people as much as you can and you do what you can in a role, even if those people above you or to the side of you might not be doing it. So when I was at the LA Neighborhood Land Trust and we were building parks, if a city council member said, I have this open lot, do you want to build the park with the community, have community ownership? Like, we would go to the community. If the community was like, we don't want a park, if they're like, we don't want a park because only gang members would hang out, then we could have a conversation and we could build something together. But if they were like, we don't want a park because we need a grocery store, we don't want a park because we need affordable housing, then we would go back to the council member and say, you know what? We can't take on your lot. What your constituents want is affordable housing. And here's who we think you should talk to about that. And so again, the council member still had the power and they could decide to go to another entity to build the park. But we knew that that's not the type of project that we wanted to do. So sometimes you have to control your own little sphere and do what you can do in that space as a way to effectuate power, with, again, knowing that, like, you may not be able to control everything, right?
Great, thanks. Some questions here. And maybe I'll just sort of take this one verbatim. Both from the perspective of COVID and environmental justice, what do you think the starting point for the struggle is? And really thinking, I think about your point about the new normal. What is it that, in a few years you think is going to be a sufficient response to the challenges we're facing now in our profession? When you sort of look forward, do you have some, you do this every day. Do you have some, these are the sort of the key things we need to be focused on right now, that are short-term, but that really affect long-term outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, one, we have to just normalize this brave space conversation and vulnerability. Like, I think that is a change that if we make, it will help in the long term. I think we have to change curriculums, right? Like, no matter what your educational background is, equity can't be the elective off to the side that the woman or the person of color who, the one professor in the department that's different than everybody else teaches. So I think we really have to change our curriculum and also change our expectations of folks who are teaching and who are leading, of what skills they have, right? There are certain skills where we will say, if you can't do X, like, you're not qualified for this job. And I think sometimes those requirements are frankly biased in ways we don't like to acknowledge. But one of those requirements should be, if you're not talking about this work, if you're not talking about equity, if you're not talking about anti-racism and anti-blackness, you're not qualified. You're obsolete. So I think we have to expect more people. I think we have to be willing to change curriculums. I think we have to really confront and normalize talking about structural racism. As the country gets more divided, we're so afraid to talk about race because we don't want to be called a racist. But if we don't talk about something, we can't fix it. So I think we have to normalize these conversations. And then, you know, this piece about struggle, and I'm glad someone used that word, because another question was, you know, how do you share this power? How do you relinquish this power? And something I would say is, like, we have to acknowledge that the reason that these things are often called a struggle is because it's not nice. There is friction. There is, you know, sometimes you have to take things. Sometimes you have to say, this is what's going to be different. And I think most importantly, those who have historically had power, white folks, have to acknowledge that they're going to lose it. They're not all of it, right? You got way too much to lose all of it, but you have to let go of some of it. And there is going to be some part that is nicely relinquishing. We need people on all sides. We need people in institutions, you know, being the political, playing the game, and we need people on the outside trying to burn it down. All of those things are important, and all of those things are what create change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The liberation on all fronts, you know, the liberating of power from white is, you know, is absolutely fundamental to this work. There is a question associated to you as a cyclist, and you mentioned that you're a cyclist. You're a passionate cyclist. You obviously advocate for cycling. What's the role of cycling in the sort of cities of the future post-pandemic? And then there's someone who wants to know what kind of bike you ride. It's on a personal level. Maybe we'll finish there.
Yeah. So I think on the what kind of bike I would buy, I have a son now, and so I'd be looking for, you know, for something, one of the European bikes with like a big front that I could put him in, put his little scoot bike in, and just get around more. But I think even before I got the bike, again, I'd be wanting the infrastructure and all of those things. And if not that, like an electric bike, why not? Everybody, you know, I think that really changes things for a lot of people. And, you know, I'm getting older, so I could use a little assist.
There you go. Thanks, Tamika. Yeah, the Portland bike share system just fully replaced all their bikes with electric bikes, and also has been very explicit about their sort of equity strategy, both in location of bikes, infrastructure associated, particularly in low income, you
know, focused on this work in very intentional ways. And I think going to your structural and distributional and procedural equity slide, that I think for our profession is a really important starting point. I also wanted to thank Tamika here reasons why it's you know, an honor to have you and to recognize the burden you carry professionally, and the leadership that you're shown. So thank you so much. There's lots of questions. We at Ecodistricts will make this recording available to everybody. And we will put folks, you know, Tamika provided her information if you want to reach out. You know, this is what she does. This is her business. So thanks again. And for all of you who are interested to learn more about our AP program in centering equity, resilience, and climate action in urban community development, please be in touch with us. Teva is the person to touch base with that. So thanks again, Tamika. Thanks to all of you listening in, and please vote. As we said in our communications this week, vote as our life depends on it, because frankly it does, I think. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon for the next webinar in November.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.